Hey, how's it going? Tim Crawford, CIO and Strategic Advisor at Avoa, and I'm here in Las Vegas at the Amazon reInvent conference. And I thought I'd just take a few minutes and share with you some of the key takeaways and some of my thoughts as I've gone through and attended several sessions and also just a bunch of meetings with executives across the organization. And so I think there are a number of things that might be interesting for you to be aware of as you think about Amazon and think about kind of where they are today. So the first thing is, had some time with Julia White, who joined last year as their CMO. And one of the things that she really kind of pressed on was this idea of reinventing the messaging. And by reinventing the messaging, it's really kind of reinventing how we think about solving some of these problems. And I think that's a really interesting place to start because as we go through time and have to reinvent our businesses, have to reinvent how we do things, I think it's going to become increasingly more important that we use that reinvent word in the way that we think, in the way that we look at technology and the impact that technology has with business. Just from a quick rundown of the numbers, 60,000 people here in Vegas. Hello, wow, there are so many people. Great showing for Amazon. Just shows that the interest in Amazon and what they're doing is just growing, growing, growing. They have taken over essentially the Las Vegas Strip from the Wynn all the way through City Center, Caesars Forum, the MGM, and all the way to Mandalay Bay. So it's definitely a huge event. 2 million people supposedly attending online as well. And if you didn't get a chance to attend in person or wasn't able to attend in person, you can definitely catch the live streams and the recordings of the keynotes. I would encourage you to go back and do that. If I were to sum up the conference on the whole, I would say that AI, AI, AI. Now, everybody's talking about AI, but there are a couple things that I'm going to point out here in the next couple minutes that I think are important to think about with regards to Amazon. Let's not forget, they've had a really great track record of building out tools for the developer. And that's continuing. That's not changing, which is good. But they're also thinking about the line of business and the business leader. And that is a market change and in a positive way. And it's also a logical step for Amazon to take. So this is kind of their AI moment, if you will. And you're going to start seeing some of the connective tissue that's happening between some of these building blocks. So whereas in the past, you might have seen Amazon coming out with different tooling to provide different features or functionality and building out some of these work streams, you're starting to see more connective tissue, and especially between the technology and the business outcomes. And I find that to be really, really interesting. So let's kind of break that down a little bit. They're not new to AI. They've got a lot of experience with working with AI. Bedrock's been out for a while. They are definitely making this connective tissue play out from the infrastructure to agents and now to what they're calling frontier agents. And we'll talk about that in a minute. They mentioned that they have 100,000 customers on Bedrock alone, 100,000 customers on Bedrock. That's an amazing number and just shows to the interest of building out these AI workloads, especially from a developer perspective. They shared some new models that they're coming out with. One of the things I think that we're starting to learn about is you need a pretty wide model garden to be successful. Enterprises are not just focused on one model. They're working across a number of different models, and Amazon is growing the number of models, and they're also adding new open weight models into the mix. That's a whole conversation in its own right, is this concept of open weight models. They did announce the new Nova 2 series of models, so the Lite, the Pro, and the Sonic. And the Sonic is actually used in speech and with their Connect product. So there's some interesting ties here between some of the core building blocks that they're doing and then some of these line of business and business outcome type solutions, Connect being one of them. I had a chance to actually look a little deeper into that. A couple months ago, I was in London at their Connect event and had an opportunity to meet with the team and do a deeper dive on Connect. And it's fascinating to see how they look at the contact center. And if you were to look at Connect as a contact center solution, you would kind of miss the point. The solution is really an AI tool that happens to do engagement with customers really well. And so it's a different way of looking at things, but let's be realistic. That's not really where customers are today. They're looking at contact center solutions, but they're going to have to evolve through this process to rethink how they engage with customers, especially as our business changes and we have to think about how we use technology very differently. So new Nova 2, Nova 2 models, which is great. New support for new models, third-party models into the mix, into the model garden. So it gives you a lot of flexibility there. They also announced a new concept, Nova Forge. And what's interesting about Forge is that, there's been this huge hurdle that has prevented a lot of enterprises from kind of building their own models, training their own models, and going down that path. And when generative AI first came out, there were a few lighthouse enterprises that put the work in to try and do this themselves and kind of roll their own. And what they quickly realized is they didn't have the expertise to be able to do it, and they didn't have the money to be able to do it long term to keep it going. And it was a lot of hard work. What Nova Forge does is kind of lowers that hurdle pretty significantly, where you can leverage the base of Nova 2 and then bring your own data to essentially create a more specialized model specific to your needs or your industry or your company. And so being able to do that is going to change, I think, the price performance dynamics when you think about models and how you use them, as well as getting more specific and away from the larger general purpose models, but starting to use your own data as part of the mix. So that's really interesting. They had already announced Agent Core. If you're not familiar with Agent Core is kind of their portfolio of tools that allows the pro-code developer to build out agentic AI workflows. And they came out initially with a core 7 functions. What they announced at this show were 2 new functions. One is policy, which is actually part of the gateway module, and then a whole new module called evaluations. And so policy allows you to start to bring policies into your agentic workflows and applying them to the agents themselves. Whereas evaluations will actually start to evaluate the agents themselves as to ensure that they're not misbehaving or kind of running off the rails. Why is this important? Well, if we look at some of the challenges that enterprises are having with AI and specifically agentic AI, it comes back to a couple of different things. One is around governance models, which is a whole nother conversation that I'll bring up and talk about later on another video or another blog post. But then the other thing is we have to think about how do you build trust into these models. And so I think it's important to think about how those concepts play out as you start to architect this process around agentic AI. And I say process very carefully because you shouldn't think of it necessarily as a technology architecture, but rather how you're changing how your business architecture evolves and changes. And this is where we kind of get from this mode of how do we take a process, automate it through agents, which some might argue is, okay, well, didn't we do that with RPA? And sort of, yeah. But we have to reimagine how we are reimagining our business and reimagining how our business does work. And what that might mean is we have to look at kind of a wider aperture And that changes the appetite for how big of a project you take on too. But you need to have that trust. And I think that's where evaluations will really kind of play a role into this. So Agent Core was really interesting. Now, what if you're not the pro code developer? Kind of going back to RPA for a minute. Um, what if you are trying to automate some workflows, trying to create ways to summarize data, kind of similar to what we saw with ChatGPT, right? You can amass all of this data, bring it together, and summarize it and get to insights very, very quickly. What if you want to automate some of those workflows, but you don't want to get the pro code developer involved with something like Agent Core? You don't need that level of sophistication. Well, that's where Quick Suite comes into play. So Quick Suite is actually a combination of two former products, Q for Business and QuickSight, that got rolled up into Quick Suite, Quick for short. So one of the things we were talking about is, just call it Quick. But it's really a way to automate some of these workflows in terms of how we work, how we process within our own individual workflow. The other thing is it lowers the hurdle where now productivity workers, the average business user, can actually start to build their own workflow based on how they work. So this is more than a co-pilot. If you think of co-pilots tend to be one-to-one. You have a co-pilot that does a very specific task or outcome. When you think of Quick or Quick Suite, think of it as a one-to-many, where you have one interface, one engagement, but it has access to a myriad of different services and files. So you might have access to all of your data files. You might have access to Salesforce information. You might have access to ServiceNow information. And it bases their security governance based off of your persona. So this is kind of a different take, right? Is that now what Tim has access to is essentially what Quick Suite, I have to be careful because I'm going to say QuickSight, kind of playing back to the old product. But what Quick Suite does is it essentially automates what you have access to, or can create these automated workflows based on what you independently have access to. So really fascinating tool. This has been rolled out across Amazon today. Initially, there were some bumps. Internally, there were some bumps. There was some good feedback. The team was sharing with me that they got some really good, candid feedback, which that's to be expected. But then I've talked to a number of Amazonians that just swear by it. They're like, this has really kind of changed the game for how I work. So I'm interested to take a closer look at this because I think this could be really fascinating. Okay. Couple of companies. I mentioned last year when I was here, a number of companies that were on the main stage. There were some that kind of stood out to me. One was Sony. So I'm a PlayStation 5 user. I know a lot of folks are. PlayStation 5 and that platform is built on top of AWS. I didn't know that. So that was fascinating to hear. But what was more fascinating is to hear kind of how they're using that within the platform. The other one is Adobe. Adobe has built out a number of their core products, including Firefly, Creative Cloud, Express, Acrobat. They're all built on top of Amazon's AI portfolio. That's impressive. I mean, what that really kind of signals, if you're the average enterprise, is Adobe is putting a lot of trust into Amazon's hands, but it also starts to show that Amazon has the trust and stability of their portfolio too, which is impressive. Okay, let's switch gears a little bit. Custom silicon. I've talked about this for quite a while, and there are a lot of other folks that do a great job of kind of digging into some of the more public conversations around GPUs, TPUs, and whatnot. One of the things that I've always found interesting about custom silicon is, and when I say custom silicon, specifically in the case of Amazon, I'm talking about like Gravitron, Inferentia, Trainium. One of the things I find really interesting about it is it really changes the price performance dynamic if you can optimize your workloads for those platforms. So it gets you away from the general purpose and in some cases really expensive tooling in silicon to things that really kind of change that price performance. There are companies that have built businesses based on the fact that the price is lower, performance is higher, uh, and they've been able to essentially build businesses on top of that because that ratio is much more favorable than using general purpose tooling. That's not to say that the general purpose silicon is bad, not by any stretch of the imagination. But I don't think enough people really kind of look at this custom silicon angle. Um, that's not to that's kind of a interesting segue to my friends at Silicon Angle. But the other thing is they announced Trainium 3. So this is their new Trainium processor. One of the things that was mentioned is that it does inference really well. And so I thought that was kind of an interesting comment to make, considering they have the Inferentia um, silicon as well. And so I kind of wonder if maybe because of silicon constraints, maybe because of other purposes, they're looking to maybe cull some of the work streams around silicon and consolidate that. I don't know that for sure, but I thought it was an interesting comment to make. But they also shared some inklings around what they're looking at with Trainium 4, which is not typical Amazon. So this is another case, just like the reinvent messaging, just like moving from just the tooling and the developer focus to looking at line of business leaders and CIOs. It was another shift, kind of a subtle but core shift, where Amazon is starting to share a little more of their roadmap, a little more about what's happening behind the scenes, and I think that's a good move for them to move a little bit in that direction. Historically, they've played it pretty close to the vest. Many of us, are kind of on the inside and get to see a lot of how the sausage gets made. But it's good to see that they're sharing some of this publicly. When you start to think about moving to these new technologies, one of the things that holds enterprises back, right, left, and center is technical debt. And Amazon has a product, Transform, that is helping enterprises kind of make that move from existing platforms to modernize them and bring them to cloud. And that in its own right is really interesting and really helpful. They had a funny activation here for a few folks. I didn't attend, but I saw the video, and you can probably look it up, where they took an old data center rack, dropped it from a crane, and blew it up. Is kind of their way of sharing that, hey, we can take this old stuff and blow it up and replace it with something new. So that was kind of cute. The other thing that's, in the category of new things, they had announced Kiro. And if you haven't looked at Kiro, it's kind of interesting. I played with it a little bit when it first came out. Kiro is Amazon's vibe coding IDE. It's a fascinating approach. And the other thing, when you look at it carefully, because it doesn't feel like Amazon interface. It doesn't feel like Amazon tooling. But at the same time, I do think that it's yet another example of how they're really trying to address some of these core issues that companies are having. One of the things that they're learning from Kiro, and there were three specific things that they learned about, and I'll include more details on this in the blog post that you can get on the website. And I'll put the QR code up, and you can go here for more information. But one of the things is they started to build out what they're calling frontier agents. Now, frontier agents are a little different in the sense that these are agents that Amazon has built that you can use to automate some of these processes and take advantage of some of the things that they've learned. And I'll get into that in more detail when I write up more details on this event. All right, let's move to Swami's keynote for a minute. So Swami Sivasubramanian, he's the VP of Agentic AI, and I'm sorry, Swami, I know I just butchered your name again. I had dinner with Swami a few months ago in New York. They're doing some amazing things within his team. On stage, he was talking about some of the real challenges that people are having when you think about how you get your arms around building, training, and optimizing models. I talked a little bit about this, right? Those lighthouse customers, enterprises that tried to do this and realized that, okay, that's probably a bridge too far for us. And so we need an alternative approach. And the reality is that Amazon came out with a slew of products announced here at the show that actually lower that bar significantly. So now you actually can take something like the Nova 2 models, use the new Nova Forge, build your own models, and be able to manage those, optimize those, and be able to manage those a lot more easily. So I tweeted a lot about this, but definitely take a look at it. Kind of in that same vein, we have to talk about, when we talk about AI, we have to talk about Connect. A lot of folks will talk about Connect. It came up in the conversation on the main stage when Matt Garman, the CEO, gave his keynote yesterday, and kind of put as a contact center solution. But again, the challenge is that companies, enterprises, are looking to change how they engage with customers. That's more than the contact center. And Connect actually does a lot more than just the fundamental call center that you might be familiar with. And so this is a piece that kind of creating that connective tissue, leveraging the tooling, leveraging the know-how, the data. 2 months ago, I mentioned I was in London, had an opportunity to meet with the team and spend some time understanding kind of how they're thinking about Connect. And while you want to meet the customer where they are and talk about it in the context of contact center, I think at some point we're going to talk more about how we connect with customers, how we engage with customers, and contact center will just be one component of that conversation as opposed to the other way around. So definitely keep an eye out for that. One of the big questions that comes up, is there an AI bubble? AI is replacing jobs. Those are common conversation points. So I'll leave the bubble talk for later, because I think that's a whole nother talk track that I don't want to get into in this particular video. But in terms of replacing jobs, I do want to hit on this because this is also something that Matt Garman kind of touched on in one of our sessions today. And my belief is, and this is based on conversations I'm having with CIOs and what I'm seeing across enterprises, is that AI is largely not directly replacing jobs. AI is not replacing jobs, but what it is doing is saying, instead of using AI to replace Tim Crawford's job, how do I use AI to increase the effectiveness or increase the ability of Tim such that I can get 2x or 3x the work from Tim? And so that you could say that, okay, well, you're still replacing jobs, future jobs that you might hire to, sure. But are you actually replacing jobs today, replacing existing jobs? And largely across the board, I'd say that's a no, because there are challenges around how agents work and what you can do with agents. And you can really only go so far until you have that trust and have the confidence and have some of the tooling in place to truly get to a point where it can replace a human. It can do some of the functions, some of the fundamental functions, and I think those are great opportunities to start with. But across the board, replacing humans and jobs, no, I don't think so. And one of the things that Garmin said, Matt Garman, CEO of Amazon, said, Amazon Web Services said, is, AI is changing jobs, not replacing them. And I would completely agree with that. If you are not leveraging AI today, you definitely need to think about how to leverage AI. That's going to be really important. You're essentially going to be in the camp of you use AI to advance and provide value to your job, or you don't. And the folks that don't, those are the folks that are going to be in trouble down the road. Today also had a session with Colleen Aubrey. So Colleen is the SVP of Applied AI. at Amazon Web Services. And one of the things that's really interesting about her team, by the way, Connect's part of that team. One of the things that's interesting about what they're doing is they're thinking really big in terms of how people work, how AI fits in. One of the things she said is, how do we just make AI usable? Kind of like a phone. So think about an iPhone. Was there a manual that came with it? We used to talk about this in the context of Google. Has anyone read the Google user manual? And the answer is no, there isn't one, because you inherently know how to use it. And the same thing to a large degree with phones. And so one of the things that Colleen mentioned is, how do we start to think about that and make it more natural, make AI more naturally consumable? And I really kind of resonate with some of the things that she said, because I do think these are the big problems that executives are fighting through and trying to resolve. Forget about technology for just a minute. And they're trying to think about how they should wrap their head around solving some of these big problems. And then the next step is, how do we start to use technology as a means to advance and accelerate that work? And so it was really good to hear that those big conversations are happening within AWS, and that's important work to be done. All right, so a couple things as I wrap here. So what's missing? So what are some things that I thought was missing that I wish that they would have talked a little bit about? And this is not a complaint about Amazon and where they are, but just things that I think could be opportunities for Amazon. So number one is, they talk a lot about multi-cloud. Now, you go back, gosh, I don't know, it was probably 10 years ago. I can remember an analyst summit that I was in when Andy Jassy was the CEO of AWS, and there was a conversation about multi-cloud. And largely back in those days, multi-cloud was not something that was up for discussion. It was not a conversation point. Times have changed. Multi-cloud's a reality. Just every enterprise that I work with, every CIO that I work with is using multi-cloud, full stop. Now, they might focus on one solution, but they have other solutions that they're using, other competing products that they're using for very specific purposes. And that's a very common usage pattern. So in addition to multi-cloud, though, hybrid cloud. So several years ago, they announced Outposts. Outposts still exists. This is Amazon's ability to take the Amazon platform and move it into your corporate data center or co-location facility. There wasn't talk about Outposts as widely as I would have expected, because enterprises are looking for ways to move some of these workloads on-prem, and even some AI workloads. And there are some reasons that enterprises are going through that conversation, some of which I think are conversations they need to think a little more about. But then there are some legitimate reasons why they're looking to do it too. And so I would have liked to have seen Amazon kind of lean into Outposts. I think at the time, Outposts was a little ahead of its time. Today, talking about hybrid cloud and the needs for on-prem as well as public cloud, now is a good time to revisit that conversation and talk about how it's evolved. There's the AI factory solution that was announced. I mean, that's essentially something that could very easily be tied into how we think about running workloads on-prem as well as cloud. So Outposts is one. Second is management of agents. There's a lot of conversation amongst vendors right now, and Amazon's no different than this, to try and reduce the friction so people have greater access to the tooling and to the opportunities. And that's a great thing. There's nothing wrong with that. That's a great thing. But if we play this out, one of the challenges we're going to quickly run into as we reduce that friction is one thing that I called agent sprawl. So just imagine now you've opened the door so that people can actually create agents, and here at the conference they were talking about seeing billions, literally billions of agents, which I think is a reality. We're going to see that sooner than later. But how do you manage that? How do you start to control it? And I think that could be interesting to have as a conversation of managing it, because then we start to marry that up with a conversation around how do we become more efficient in how we use these resources, whether it's computing resources, AI resources, energy, water, data center capacity, all of these come into play. And so management of agents, and especially that agentic sprawl that's going to be coming, and then that opens the door into potential cybersecurity issues if you don't have a good way to manage it. That's going to be a conversation we're going to have sooner than later. And then the last item, and again, this is kind of more of it's a sign of where they are today in the process, and I think where Amazon is today in terms of their agentic platform is great, but I would have liked to have seen a little more on the storyline of connecting how agentic works end to end, going from quick, more line of business, low code, no code, kind of that kind of approach to agent core, and how those kind of tie together. So rather than just a collection of tools, how do we start to think about each of these along the process? And so I think that's probably the next conversation we'll have about this, and something you can look forward to, I would assume. But still, no fault to Amazon. I think it's just something I wish there was a little more of a conversation around. All right, so let's wrap this. We're about 30 minutes in. Let's wrap this. So number one takeaway, Amazon's all about AI. And it was AI, AI, AI. But unlike past conversations about AI that many have, there was a lot of meat on the bones here. There was a lot to talk about. The number of products, it was impressive. It was impressive, but I think the other thing that's really impressive is how they're thinking about it in the context of process and how applications get built, but how they also get consumed. And then you're also starting to see not just a focus on the builder, not taking away from the builder, but looking at the line of business and some of these business outcomes with things like Quick Suite and Connect. And I think those are two spaces I would definitely keep your eye on moving forward, because those are two that are heading in a direction that starts to open other doors for Amazon Web Services. The second thing is, Amazon is as much an infrastructure company as it is a software company. And so, there could be an interesting thought experiment and conversation. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Are they an infrastructure company, or are they a software company, or are they a software company that feeds the infrastructure engine, which could be more profitable if you're an investor? So I think that's also important for CIOs and executives to think about too, because as you start to align yourself with different partners and choose different tools and different companies to work with, you have to think about longevity in terms of where they're going and how that aligns with your own strategy. So, interesting conversation. Love to hear your thoughts there. And then lastly, I mentioned this a couple times, thinking beyond the tools and putting a lot of thought as to outcomes. And what I mean by that is that Amazon Web Services is starting to do a really good job of thinking about what's the impact to the business. So rather than just simply, this is a tool that will allow you to do X, which has its own value proposition and nothing wrong with that, but they're starting to think about higher level functions, which will appeal to executives, appeal to CIOs, appeal to CEOs, and CMOs in terms of how do you start to rethink your company, rethink your business, and then be able to reimagine it, right? And this gets back kind of full circle to where Julia White started with, let's rethink the title of this conference, which is Reinvent. And how do we reinvent ourselves? So that's what I have for now. I'll have more. QR code gets you to the website with the blog. I'll have more later on this, but I'd love to hear your thoughts. What stood out for you? What are you looking for more of? What was surprising to you? I had a number of conversations just in the last 2.5 days that I've been here so far, and more to come. So thanks for listening, and looking forward to engaging with you soon.